everyone, welcome to the presentation on my final paper. So I went with prompt number 1, which reads, how do you understand the importance of reading beyond what Adichie calls a single story? How has reading beyond the traditional canon in this class enriched your experience and impacted your understanding of different societies and cultures throughout place and time? Support your argument by drawing on Adichie's TED Talk and other texts from the course readings or films to answer the question. So my thesis is, by reading beyond the traditional canon, I've had the opportunity to appreciate the importance of giving a voice to the underrepresented in literature, which is one step forward in moving past the detrimental effects of the single stories that have been perpetuated. In my introduction, I first start out by talking about how America is located on stolen land and built by slaves, and that despite this history, our high school curriculum and canon is not very reflective of this, but instead kind of ignores this part of history. And then I say how this class has changed the way I look at historical events, because now I understand why certain parts of history are included and left out, and have even gotten to read the perspective of some of this left out history. So in paragraph 1, I talk about Mary Witt's Defining the Humanities and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story, and I start off by connecting the two by saying that the traditional canon can be classified as a single story because it's not reflective of America's cultures and values, and definitely not reflective of the world's cultures and values. And so because of this, the traditional canon really only shows us a single story throughout its texts. And going off of this, I say that the canon cannot be ignored but needs to be held accountable. And this is something that a lot of people talked about in week 1 in their discussion board posts, and I think it's very true because while we can't just blindly go off of the canon, it does create a basis for many historical events. So that's why it's really important to find the balance between texts from the traditional canon and incorporating new texts. Lastly, I talk about the interdisciplinary method, which is a concept that Mary Witt talks about in her article, and this is bringing in the separate fields of study to come to a new understanding. And this is exactly what we did in this class, because for each text we talked about the author's biography, history of the text, themes, past and contemporary issues, and we compared it to the single story that usually had been told. Taking into account all of these different fields is very important because it gives us the complete picture of the text so that we're not falling into the single story trap. In paragraph 2, this is where I introduce the text that we read, and I focus with Sherman Alexie. He is a Native American author who wrote Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, which we read snippets of in the beginning of the year. So I talk about Louise Erdrich, who is another prominent Native American writer who wrote this novel called Love Medicine about a Native American family, and I read this novel in high school. And so in my essay, I kind of reflect on how much I feel like I missed out when I read it because we didn't really take this interdisciplinary approach like in Ryer's class. So I didn't really learn as much about the history and about stereotypes as I wish I did. So I just talk about how big of a difference learning about Alexie was because of this approach we took and how much more I got out of this approach from what I've learned about Native Americans in general. So switching gears, I talk about stereotypes and representation, which were the two big components that we learned in this section of the class. And I have this quote from Adichie that says, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they're incomplete." And I really like this quote because I think there is a lot of justification around stereotypes because they do have some truth to them. However, because they are so incomplete, that really shows the danger of having these stereotypes. So on the topic of stereotypes, I talk about Pocahontas and the media. And so for me growing up, Pocahontas was the only exposure I had to the conflicts of Native Americans and Europeans until, actually learning about it in a history class. And so obviously Pocahontas is a kid's Disney movie, so it's going to be super sugar-coated and have to have a happy ending, but it really perpetuates the stereotype of Native Americans being savages and underdeveloped. And this is very detrimental because Native Americans already have little to no representation in the media, and when they do, it's only showing these stereotypes. So this plays right into Sherman Alexie's essay, I Hated Tonto, Still Do. And in this, he reflects on what it was like growing up as a Native American boy where the representation was very little, and then when there was representation, it was very stereotypical and not reflective of what his people were like at all. So we really see the effects this has on him and other Native American boys growing up seeing these inaccurate stereotypes in the media. So we read his short story, Alexie's short story, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, and this book is very real and attacks the issues of Native Americans head on. And one way we see this is with the issue of alcoholism. So it is a very common stereotype that Native Americans are alcoholics. And if we go back to Adichie's quote, she says, "The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they're incomplete." So in this class, we actually learned the history of how alcoholism became an issue with the Native Americans. And through his novel, Alexie shows us that it is in fact an issue within his community. And he also shows us how deep of an issue it is. So with all this information, we have a deeper understanding of alcoholism past the common stereotype. which is a highlight from this class, and that we were able to, come to this conclusion, and also shows the beauty of Alexi's writing, how he can take a stereotype like this and give us a more raw context. So in my third paragraph, I focus on I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, and I start off by talking about my personal knowledge history of the Salem witch trials, which is very minimal because I did not read The Crucible in high school, and so I didn't know who Tituba was, and basically I just didn't really know that much at all about the Salem witch trials, but I think this gave me a very clear, fresh start to this novel, and having the opportunity to read Tituba's story first before that of the Puritan perspective is pretty special and kind of cool, in my opinion. So I really enjoyed the foreword by Angela Davis because I felt that it set up the story really well. She talks about the power in Tituba's retelling of the story, and I use a quote that says, "Tituba's impassioned efforts to revoke her own disappearance from history, Maurice Conde's fictional revision of her story, is Tituba's revenge." So from this quote, we see how powerful it is that Tituba got to retell her story, because one, she finally gets to tell her story, and two, her story acts as revenge to all the terrible things that happened to her. So from here, I talk about the theme of hypocrisy of religion, and I found this theme very important and powerful when talking about the power shift from the Puritans to Tituba, because this is a key theme that Conde uses to shift the narrative against the Puritans, because it makes the audience question the Puritans' intentions, morals, and most importantly, their credibility in telling Tituba's story. And with the theme of hypocrisy of religion, it also addresses one of the prompt questions that asks about our understanding of different societies. And so from Tituba's perspective and through this hypocrisy we see, we can really understand the society she lived in, which, gives us a really good basis to understanding her side of the story. So it's impossible to look at Tituba's place in society without taking into consideration that she is a Black woman, which is what I touch in at the end with intersectionality. So in this section, I talk about how important it is to take into account Tituba being a Black woman with healing abilities, because all these things intersect with each other to make her life so hard and also unique. Wrapping things up, I start off by talking about Conde and Alexi and how they both branch away from the canon in the single story. And Alexi does this by focusing on stereotypes and representation, while Conde gives us a new perspective to a common historical event. And next I talk about how much can be learned from the non-canon novels, because, obviously we are getting all of these missing parts from history that we've never learned about, and then also getting this new perspective is crucial. And I expand on this a little by saying, in life in general, it's super important to have different perspectives because the world is so big and there's so many different things to learn. So wrapping things up, I talk about how many issues in these novels require a lot of change, and a lot of this change is stuff that's kind of like out of our hands, like governmental policies and like actual structural change in our country. However, as readers, taking the time to appreciate and understand the work put out by these authors is one step we can take to appreciate their history and become more inclusive as a country. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'm realizing now I went a little bit over, so I do apologize for that. But if you guys have any constructive criticism or any other ideas for my paper, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I look forward to watching all of your guys' presentations.